He stood in silence, the weight of the 5-year contract hanging over him like a shroud. To the world, he was nothing more than an invisible servant. He watched the steam rise from the pot, his movements practiced and devoid of pride. The wife swept into the room, her designer blouse bright against the drab interior. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed instead on the glowing screen of her phone. To her, he was merely furniture, a fixture in her life that existed to be ordered around. The air crackled with a sudden, sharp tension. The wife tossed her handbag toward the couch, a gesture of careless entitlement. The silence between them was not peaceful, it was a wall designed to keep him in his place. The CEO arrived, his presence tainting the air of their home. He carried the remnants of a failed business deal, a reckless gamble that he now intended to bury. The protagonist stood in the corner, eyes averted, playing his role perfectly. The wife demanded an apology, her voice dripping with artificial outrage. She pointed at the protagonist, demanding he take the fall for the CEO's gross negligence. He remained still, knowing that a single word of defiance would invite scrutiny he couldn't afford. The CEO smirked, relieved to have found his target. He leaned in close, his predatory gaze heavy with malice. He knew the protagonist had no recourse, trapped by his own engineered poverty. The protagonist offered the apology, his voice low and monotone. Every syllable was calculated to be just pathetic enough to satisfy them. He felt the cold sting of their laughter, a small price for his long-term goal. The mother-in-law swept in, her fur coat heavy with the scent of vanity. She immediately began searching for the protagonist, her eyes scanning for weakness. She lived for the small, stinging humiliation she could inflict upon him. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, immediately demanding his monthly savings. Her tone was sharp, a demand dressed as a household duty. She saw him not as a son-in-law, but as a bank that occasionally needed to be squeezed. The protagonist retreated to the counter, opening a rusted tin box where he kept his meager cash. Each bill he handed over felt like a heavy stone on his conscience. Yet, he surrendered the money without a flicker of hesitation or regret. The mother-in-law snatched the money, her eyes never meeting his. She turned toward the wife, a predatory smile forming on her lips as she pocketed the loot. The protagonist remained in the shadows, his face an unreadable mask of subservience. Inside the bedroom, the CEO began to sweat, his bravado crumbling as he checked the markets. The failed deal was spiraling, and the legal repercussions were looming closer by the second. He needed a distraction, and the wife was all too happy to oblige. The wife started demanding more from the protagonist, her greed fueled by the mother-in-law's earlier success. She wanted expensive jewelry, something to match the status she felt she deserved. The cycle of extraction was accelerating. The protagonist looked out at the city, the skyscrapers reflecting in his calm, grey eyes. He was the only one in the room who knew how fragile their reality truly was. He remained silent, allowing them to believe they had won every encounter. A sharp knock sounded at the door, freezing the trio in their tracks. It was the rival, a shadow from the business world they had all hoped to forget. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted from smug arrogance to cold, sharp terror. The rival stepped inside without invitation, his presence eclipsing everyone else in the room. He didn't look at the wife or the mother-in-law, his eyes immediately locking onto the protagonist. There was a flicker of recognition, a dangerous secret shared in the silence. The CEO tried to intervene, but the rival's icy glare silenced him instantly. The wife cowered behind the mother-in-law, the sudden shift in power rendering them both mute. The protagonist remained in his corner, his silence now feeling like an iron cage. The rival finally spoke, his voice calm and lethal. He addressed the protagonist, his words a direct challenge to the contract's protective veil. The room felt like it was shrinking around the fragile lie the protagonist had maintained for years. The protagonist stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the floor. For the first time, he met the rival's gaze directly, his grey eyes losing their dullness. The air felt charged, a storm ready to break within the confined space of their home. He pulled a single, heavy document from his inner pocket and placed it on the coffee table. It was the contract, its ink dark and final against the glass surface. The wife gasped, the realization dawning on her that she had never known the man she had called a servant. The office is quiet, save for the hum of the ventilation system. A shadow moves quickly, sliding a thick envelope into the bottom drawer. The trap has been set with meticulous, cold precision. He walks into the office, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. He notices the slight misalignment of the drawer handle. He says nothing, his face a mask of practiced, silent obedience. He doesn't open the drawer. Instead, he turns away, knowing exactly whose fingerprints are on the trap. The game has begun, and he is ready to play the fool. The wife adjusts her jewelry, her face set in a performance of deep, wounded betrayal. She meets her allies to coordinate the public narrative. Her voice is soft, calculated, and sharp. The CEO paces the floor, sweat beading on his forehead as he reviews the forged documents. He is desperate to consolidate power before the audit. He needs a scapegoat, and he has chosen the perfect target. The rival watches from the shadows, his eyes cold and calculating. He sees the CEO's panic and the wife's schemes converging on one man. He remains still, waiting for the blood to be drawn. The protagonist walks past them, his head bowed, carrying a stack of files. He catches a glimpse of their conspiring expressions. He doesn't falter, keeping his rhythm perfectly steady. The CEO summons the protagonist, his voice thick with fake sympathy. He asks for a progress report on the very accounts he plans to claim are stolen. The protagonist agrees, his compliance absolute. The wife cornered him near the water cooler, her face twisted in feigned pity. She tells him to confess before things get worse, hoping to extract a preemptive admission. He remains silent, offering only a polite nod. The mother-in-law confronts him, her voice dripping with venom. She warns him that his marriage is over and his career is finished. He doesn't even blink, his expression as empty as a blank page. Rumors spread like wildfire through the office walls. People whisper, glancing his way with eyes full of mockery. He ignores it all, focusing only on the rhythm of his own breathing. The CEO makes the final call to the board of directors. He is sweating, his confidence slipping as he finalizes the betrayal. He prints the fake files, convinced of his imminent victory. He sits quietly, watching the clock tick down to the meeting time. He checks his watch, a flicker of something ancient and dangerous in his expression. The trap is now fully primed. The wife meets the CEO at the door, sharing a brief, triumphant look. They enter together, a united front ready to destroy a man they believe is defenseless. The stage is set for the final humiliation. He follows them in, his demeanor perfectly subservient. He takes his seat at the far end of the long table. The air is thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive cologne. The CEO stands, slamming a file onto the table. He begins his speech, his voice booming with fake indignation. He accuses the protagonist of grand larceny, his finger pointed directly at his chest. The wife adds her testimony, her voice cracking with performative sobs. The board members murmur, their faces turning towards the protagonist with disgust. He sits perfectly still, refusing to defend himself. The CEO demands the protagonist hand over his badge and security clearance. The protagonist stands, moving with a sudden, eerie grace. He reaches into his jacket, not for the documents, but for his phone. He hits send on his phone. Instantly, every screen in the room turns black, then flashes with a single, glowing red notification. The CEO's face goes pale as the truth hits the screens. The protagonist rises, his posture changing. He is taller, sharper, more dangerous. He looks at his wife, then at the CEO, his voice cold and clear. The 5-year contract is finally void. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. The protagonist sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly on the cold metal surface. He was not waiting for an attorney, but for a signal that the 5-year clock had finally struck midnight. A phone rang, piercing through the precinct's chaotic atmosphere like a gunshot. The captain picked up the receiver, his expression shifting from annoyance to pure, unfiltered terror as he listened to the voice on the other end. He dropped the phone, his face drained of all color. The iron bolt slid back with a grating screech that echoed down the hallway. Guards who had treated the protagonist like garbage only an hour ago now stepped back, heads bowed in sudden deference. He rose slowly, smoothing out the frayed cuffs of his shirt as if stepping into a kingdom. He bypassed the security protocols with the ease of a man walking through his own front door. His fingers danced across the holographic interface, routing assets through dozens of shell companies. Each transfer was a surgical strike against the empire that thought it had shackled him. The CEO stared at his screens, watching the ticker symbols turn red in real time. Millions were hemorrhaging from his accounts, vanishing into digital voids he couldn't track. He roared in frustration, overturning a glass of expensive scotch onto his mahogany desk. The wife stood frozen as her credit card was declined for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Panic began to claw at her throat, replacing her usual arrogant facade with something much sharper. She frantically checked her banking app, only to find a balance of 0. The mother-in-law entered the room, her voice a sharp demand for service that went unanswered. She found the house unnervingly quiet, a stark departure from the usual bustling staff. Her face twisted into a mask of indignation as she realized nobody was coming to cater to her whims. The rival watched the market data, his icy eyes narrowed in suspicion as he noted the strange movement of capital. He recognized the pattern, a ghost from the past he thought had been buried 5 years ago. His knuckles drummed against the glass table, a signal of his growing agitation. The protagonist stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the police station. He adjusted his collar, his shadow long and imposing against the wet brick walls. He took a single breath, savoring the taste of absolute freedom. The CEO frantically dialed his associates, his voice cracking under the weight of his mounting debt. Everyone was either unavailable or pretending they didn't know his name. He realized then that he wasn't just losing money, he was being erased. The wife marched toward her husband's office, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. Her anger was a shield, masking the dread that had started to settle in her stomach. She was ready to demand answers for the strange warnings appearing on her accounts. She burst through the doors, only to find the CEO standing in the center of the room, looking utterly defeated. He didn't even look at her, his eyes fixed on the empty screen of his main terminal. The life they had curated so carefully was crumbling to dust. The mother-in-law was frantically shoving jewelry into a small leather bag. Her hands shook, causing a diamond necklace to snag on the lace of her nightgown. She knew if the money vanished, the facade of their family's prestige would vanish with it. The rival stepped out of his car, his movements fluid and predatory. He had tracked the digital footprints to this specific location, a private terminal used by high-level insiders. He wasn't just looking for money, he was looking for the man he intended to break. The protagonist paused, sensing a presence nearby. He didn't panic. he simply hit enter, finalizing the last transfer of the corporate assets into his private trust. The screen flickered, a success message displayed in elegant, cold typeface. The door swung open with a heavy thud, revealing the rival standing there. He expected to see a desperate hacker, but instead, he found the protagonist sitting calmly, checking his watch. The air in the room grew heavy with the collision of two titans. The rival stepped forward, a smug grin forming on his lips as he prepared to dismantle the protagonist. He began to speak, but the protagonist cut him off with a single, icy look that stopped him in his tracks. The power dynamic shifted, leaving the rival looking suddenly small. The protagonist stood up, revealing a height and presence the rival hadn't anticipated. He walked past the rival, not even bothering to look at him as he exited the room. The rival stood paralyzed, his own ambition turning into a trap he couldn't escape. The CEO and his wife met the protagonist in the center of the lobby, surrounded by onlookers. The CEO lunged forward, but the protagonist didn't even flinch. He simply held up a single, black digital key, the symbol of the company's new ownership. He handed the key to the wife, watching as her face crumbled in realization of what it meant. She looked down at the key, then back at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning understanding. The 5-year contract was over, and the war was only just beginning. The morning sun cut through the glass, illuminating the frantic footsteps of junior analysts. Chaos reigned as the digital ticker on the wall flickered red, signaling a massive, unauthorized transfer. No one noticed the man in the faded, ill-fitting shirt standing near the revolving doors. Inside the executive suite, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and desperation. The CEO slammed his fist against the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. He stared at the blank screens that moments ago held his empire's fortune. A sharp knock echoed through the room, but the CEO was too paralyzed to answer. The protagonist stood in the hallway, clutching a stack of discarded files. He watched the man who once humiliated him descend into a frantic, spiraling panic. The protagonist walked past the glass wall with deliberate, slow steps. He adjusted his fraying cuffs, a gesture of practiced insignificance. He was an invisible gear in a machine he now owned entirely. The wife stood by the elevators, her expensive silk blouse strained as she fumbled with her phone. She was frantic, unaware that her luxury lifestyle had just been stripped away by an anonymous shell company. She didn't spare a glance for the servant walking by. The CEO shouted into his phone, demanding answers from offshore banks that had already severed ties. His desk was littered with legal documents, now useless paper. He was hunting for a ghost he couldn't name. The protagonist stopped to fill a plastic cup with water, his movements rhythmic and steady. He heard the muffled screams of the CEO from the hallway. He drank, feeling the cold liquid wash away 5 years of silence. The mother-in-law arrived, her fur coat heavy, her expression one of cold entitlement. She sought the CEO to demand funds for an upcoming gala. She looked past the protagonist as if he were furniture. The CEO emerged, his eyes wild and unfocused, nearly colliding with the protagonist. He didn't see the man who owned his debts, he only saw an obstacle to his escape. He shoved the protagonist aside without a word. Hidden away in the quiet, the protagonist accessed a terminal. With a few keystrokes, he locked the CEO out of the final liquidity accounts. He remained the silent observer, his net worth hidden behind ironclad privacy walls. The rival arrived, walking with the heavy, calculated steps of a shark. He had smelled the blood in the water. He didn't acknowledge anyone, his gaze fixed on the executive floor with predatory hunger. The CEO collapsed into his chair as the rival entered without permission. The air in the room grew heavy, the power dynamic shifting in an instant. The rival smiled, a gesture devoid of warmth. The wife watched the rival enter the office from a distance, her intuition warning her of danger. She pulled at her gold necklace, her poise beginning to crack under the weight of the unknown. Everything she built was slipping away. The protagonist hovered nearby, a shadow in a cheap uniform. He watched the rival, knowing the man was walking into a phantom market crash. The irony was sweet, kept locked behind his practiced, empty face. The CEO tried to stand, but his legs failed him. He was losing control of his board, his staff, and his sanity. The rival leaned in, whispering something that broke the remaining shell of the CEO's resolve. The wife burst into the room, her composure finally shattered. She demanded to know who had initiated the sell-off. The CEO just stared at her, his mind empty and broken, unable to offer an answer. The mother-in-law entered, gasping at the sight of her son-in-law's defeat. She clutched her pendant, the symbol of her status now worth nothing. The power dynamic in the room was irrevocably shattered. The protagonist stepped forward, finally breaking his silence. He didn't look at them as equals, he looked at them as a man looks at old, broken toys. He held a single, crisp document in his hand. The CEO looked up, finally focusing on the man he had ignored for years. He saw the shift in posture, the coldness in the eyes, a man he didn't recognize. The document hit the desk with a sound like a gavel. The silence in the room was deafening. The protagonist smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, it was the smile of a predator that had finally been released from its cage. Everything was about to change. The wife stares at her reflection, her hands trembling as she runs them over the fabric of her favorite couture gown. It feels brittle, like cheap paper. She knows this dress cost a fortune, yet the stitching unravels at the slightest tug. The illusion of her perfect life is starting to fray at the edges. The protagonist sits in the corner, his back turned to the door, observing the chaos through a small mirror. He keeps his expression flat, neutral, and entirely devoid of life. He knows the contract requires silence, and silence is the deadliest weapon he possesses. He watches her panic grow with clinical detachment. The CEO reaches for the brass handle of the lounge, expecting the usual deferential treatment from the staff. Instead, the door remains locked, its heavy frame immovable. The digital display flashes a jarring red alert, denying his credentials. His world is suddenly becoming very small. The wife turns on her husband, her blue eyes sharp with sudden, irrational fury. She demands to know why her designer assets are failing. She refuses to believe that her social standing is slipping. Her voice echoes against the marble countertops. The protagonist says nothing, merely continuing to polish the silverware with rhythmic, obsessive precision. His silence is like a wall, frustrating her even further. He offers no defense and no explanation, keeping his zero net worth cover perfectly intact. He is merely an object in her eyes, beneath notice. The CEO paces the length of his office, his phone pressed firmly against his ear. He is shouting into the receiver, but the silence on the other end confirms his worst fears. Even his closest subordinates are no longer answering his calls. He is being erased from the corporate network. The mother-in-law enters, her face twisted in indignation as she spots the discarded clothes piled on the rug. She views the situation as a personal insult to her family's name. She doesn't see a tragedy, she sees an inconvenience. She blames the wife for not maintaining appearances. The wife snaps back, her composure finally breaking into sharp, jagged edges. She yells about the lack of support and the sudden isolation they are all facing. Her golden jewelry feels like chains now. The house that once felt like a palace now feels like a cage. The protagonist leans against the cold wall, listening to the muffled shouting from the living room. He glances at his watch, noting the time remaining on his firm's restrictive contract. He is waiting for the precise moment when the house of cards collapses completely. He remains a shadow, unnoticed and unbothered. The CEO bangs his fists against the steering wheel, his breathing heavy and ragged. He tries to access his offshore accounts, but the screen displays a persistent error. He realizes he has been locked out of his own life. The silence of the garage is suffocating. The mother-in-law grabs the wife's arm, forcing her to acknowledge the reality of their situation. She demands to know where the money went, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. She isn't concerned with the wife's welfare, only her own plummeting status. The greed is palpable in the room. The wife pulls away, accusing the mother-in-law of being the one who spent the reserves on her own vanity projects. She points at the diamonds, mocking their value now that the company is failing. Their domestic relationship has completely devolved into a power struggle for the scraps. The CEO enters, his face flushed with uncharacteristic panic. He slams the door behind him, his presence disrupting the tense standoff between the two women. He looks like a man who has lost everything and is desperate to blame someone. The tension in the room hits a breaking point. They all converge, pointing fingers in a chaotic circle of accusation. The CEO blames the wife's spending, she blames his mismanagement, the mother-in-law blames both for their incompetence. None of them notice the silent figure watching from the shadows of the doorway. The cycle of blame is their own trap. The protagonist steps forward just an inch, his face partially caught in a beam of light. His expression is one of hollow calm. He remains the silent observer, his net worth zero, his profile invisible. He is the catalyst they never saw coming. The CEO grabs the protagonist by the collar, dragging him into the light. He screams at him for being lazy and useless, venting his frustration physically. He expects a cowering reaction, but the protagonist's body remains limp and unaffected. He is essentially attacking a stone. The wife watches in stunned silence, realizing the protagonist hasn't blinked in minutes. There is no fear in his eyes, only a hollow void that unnerves her more than any shout. The power dynamic shifts in an instant, though only the protagonist knows why. She takes a hesitant step backward. The protagonist pushes the CEO's hand away with a single, practiced movement. It is not an act of aggression, but of profound, unsettling detachment. He walks toward the door, his movements fluid and precise. The family is left frozen in the middle of their own chaos. As he reaches for the door, the protagonist pauses, his hand hovering over the lock. He does not turn around, but he speaks into the silence. His voice is cold, clear, and utterly unrecognizable to them. The atmosphere in the room drops several degrees in an instant. He opens the door to reveal a man in a sharp gray suit standing on the other side. The visitor bows deeply to the protagonist, acknowledging him as the true owner of the firm. The family watches in horror as the veil of the servant falls away to reveal a predator. The silent observer has finally arrived. The CEO leaned back, his laughter echoing off the cold glass. He saw only a penniless servant standing before him, not a man who controlled his entire firm's liquidity. The termination papers lay waiting like a death sentence. The protagonist reached out with a steady hand. He didn't speak, his silence a shield for the billions he held in the dark. He picked up the fountain pen with deliberate slowness. As the final signature bloomed across the document, the air in the room seemed to thin. The CEO froze, his mirth vanishing instantly. He had signed his own professional execution. The wife marched toward the double doors, her heels clicking like a countdown. She had arrived to gloat, expecting to see her husband tossed out on the street. Her expression was a mask of cold anticipation. She threw the door open, ready to deliver the final insult. Instead, she found the room suffocating in an unnatural, heavy silence. The CEO stood trembling near the window. The CEO could not even look at her, his hands gripping the mahogany edge of his desk. He looked like a man watching his life's work dissolve into ash. The protagonist stood perfectly still, his eyes devoid of any triumph. She stepped forward, clutching her purse. "What have you done?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the stifling tension. She ignored the protagonist, focusing entirely on the broken man before her. The CEO pointed a shaking finger at the man in the faded shirt. "He owns it all," he rasped, his voice barely audible. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The wife turned slowly, her blue eyes narrowing in disbelief. She looked at the man she had treated as a servant for years. Her model-like face contorted with a flicker of genuine shock. The protagonist adjusted his cuffs, his expression remaining neutral and detached. He looked no different than the day he started his contract. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on the woman who thought she was safe. She snatched the papers from the desk, her manicured fingers trembling. As she read the transfer details, the foundation of her world began to crumble. Everything she took for granted was legally, irrevocably gone. She turned to the protagonist, her voice rising in a jagged, desperate pitch. She begged for an explanation, for a lie, for anything but the truth. The protagonist remained silent, his gaze fixed on a point behind her shoulder. The CEO collapsed into his leather chair, a hollow man. He was no longer a person of authority, but a discarded tool. The shift in power was absolute. The protagonist finally moved, stepping toward the door with a calm, measured pace. He paused, his shadow stretching across the floor to touch the wife's designer shoes. He still hadn't said a single word. The wife lunged forward, grabbing his sleeve, her composure entirely shattered. She was now the one begging, and he was the one in command. The irony was as sharp as the edges of the room. He gently removed her hand from his arm, his fingers cold and detached. He leaned in, finally breaking his silence just to whisper a single, chilling truth into her ear. Her eyes widened, realizing the game had been over long ago. As he pulled away, she fell back, losing her grip on her pride entirely. The CEO watched them, unable to process the shifting tides of his own life. The office, once a fortress, was now a tomb for their ambition. He walked out of the office, his back perfectly straight, leaving them in the wreckage of their own making. He hadn't changed his clothes, he hadn't raised his voice, yet the world had shifted. The silent observer was finally ready to speak. A figure emerged from the shadows of the corridor, his eyes cold and familiar. It was the rival, waiting for the exact moment the protagonist would emerge. He knew the secrets that remained hidden. The two men stood face to face, the air charged with an electric tension. The rival smiled, a gesture that held no warmth and all the threat in the world. The real war was just beginning.